Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're answering the question of how well Alan Wake 2 runs on graphics cards that don't support mesh shaders, a topic that came up in our recent Q&A episode that we wanted to address after the game launched. This all stems from a comment made by one of Alan Wake 2's developers stating the game is built to use mesh shaders and isn't supported on older GPU architectures as a result. This was a problematic statement for owners of older graphics cards, in particular the Radeon RX 5000 series from AMD and GeForce 10 series from Nvidia, the most recent line from either brand that doesn't support mesh shaders. Basically, mesh shaders were introduced with DirectX 12 Ultimate, and the first architectures to support the full DX12 Ultimate feature set were Nvidia's Turing and AMD's RDNA 2. In particular, this threw up an interesting comparison between RDNA 1 and Turing, which were both released at around the same time. A popular product like the Radeon RX 5700 XT did not support mesh shaders at launch, but the competing GeForce RTX 2060 Super did, and the argument some were making is that it's this DirectX 12 Ultimate support that would make the RTX 2060 Super age better. In contrast, we recommended the 5700 XT and found last year that it still beat the RTX 2060 Super by 13% on average across 33 games at 1440p using rasterization. Alan Wake 2 is the first game to heavily utilize mesh shaders, so we received a few comments asking us whether this game would make us reevaluate our stance and recommendation from 4 years ago. But the talk of Alan Wake 2 not working on cards that didn't support mesh shaders was a bit premature, as the game actually does launch and run on those older graphics cards, albeit with a warning at the start. So it's not the case where you can play the game on an RTX 2060 Super, but can't launch it at all on the RX 5700 XT. Both GPUs are capable of launching the game. But launching the game is one thing, playing the game is another, so let's find out whether this key feature difference between the 5700 XT and RTX 2060 Super leads to a noticeable difference in performance and overall experience. This isn't our full GPU benchmark video, which might come next week, but an early look given we just talked about this topic a few days ago. All testing was done on my AMD Ryzen 7 7800X 3D test system equipped with 32GB of DDR5 6000 memory. The latest display drivers were used for both the GeForce and Radeon GPUs as of the time of filming. Both of those did support Alan Wake 2 with day one updates, so let's get into it. First up, I have some gameplay footage of the RX 5700 XT running Alan Wake 2 at 1080p using the low preset. This is native 1080p, but because the game only has DLSS and FSR rendering paths, you can't use a traditional native resolution with TAA, for example. This is FSR2 with the render scale set to native 1080p. Now there's good and bad news here. The good news is that the game works, and despite the developers' warning of poor performance, visual glitches and crashing, those haven't been major concerns during my time testing it. I haven't experienced any crashing, and visual glitches don't seem to be commonplace. Even performance seems relatively stable. The 5700 XT doesn't produce horrific stuttering, for example. The bad news though is performance is generally pretty poor, hovering around 30 FPS during the most intensive parts of the game that we've found so far, which is this opening section in a foliage-heavy forest area. And it's not a consistent 30 FPS. There were noticeable dips into the 20s, as well as other sections that ran more around 40 to 50 FPS. This area in particular near the car park really did not run well, and that was on the low preset at 1080p. Now, the low preset in the game isn't entirely the lowest possible settings. There are several individual settings that can be turned down further, but I don't recommend doing this as the game looks significantly worse on sub-low settings. It doesn't even improve performance all that much on the 5700 XT, delivering near or below 40 FPS in intensive areas. So the low preset is pretty much what you'd want to use, and with that configuration, Alan Wake 2 really isn't playable on the 5700 XT. 30 FPS, it's not a good experience in 2023, and even then, the 5700 XT is incapable of a consistent 30 FPS. The low preset, in my opinion, actually looks very good as far as low presets go, so I wouldn't say this is unoptimized or ridiculous, but it does restrict Alan Wake 2 to more powerful hardware. What happens if you purchased a graphics card back in 2019 that did support mesh shaders, that being the RTX 2060 Super, which was available at the same $400 price point as the 5700 XT? Again, Good news and bad news here. The good news is that the 2060 Super is quite a bit faster than the 5700 XT in this intensive area of Alan Wake 2. NVIDIA's equivalent Turing GPU is able to push out around 40 FPS using native 1080p with the low preset, with occasional dips into the 30s and some areas where performance is closer to 50 FPS. Definitely a better experience than what the mesh shader lacking 5700 XT can do. However, I wouldn't class the 2060 Super as being especially playable in this title. Average performance is only around 41 FPS in the area we primarily tested, and that's the low preset at native 1080p. Even with the DLSS quality setting, which is not great in terms of image quality, though better than most of the FSR settings, we only improved that to 48 FPS on average, which is still well short of our minimum 60 FPS target at an unimpressive level of detail. Whether or not that is playable to you will depend on your definition of playable. There are, of course, some gamers that believe 30 FPS is playable, which I would strongly disagree with, but I think it's safe to say the overall performance of the 2060 Super in this game at 1080p using low settings is not good, and the 5700 XT is even worse. Terrible would be the right word to use there. Here's how the two GPUs stack up across the main presets, as well as upscaling using the quality mode, FSR2 for the AMD GPU and DLSS for the NVIDIA GPU, which is likely how most people would play. We really do not recommend using upscaling at 1080p, and if you have to, the quality mode is the only suitable mode. Once you start talking about balanced or performance mode upscaling at such a low render resolution, you may as well not bother unless you love an extremely blurry presentation. Anyway, using the low preset, the RTX 2060 Super has a sizable advantage without pushing the GPU into very playable territory. In this area, the 2060 Super was about 30% faster, a margin that is pretty consistent using the medium and high presets as well. Most notably, the 2060 Super has much better 1% lows, showing that in those most performance-intensive areas, the NVIDIA GPU suffers the least. When upscaling is factored in, the 2060 Super ended up 28% faster, which again is as expected based on the native resolution testing. However, as the quality difference between FSR2 quality and DLSS quality is very noticeable at 1080p, these numbers are a bit pointless and if anything benefit the red team. This is why NVIDIA fanboys shouldn't be pushing for NVIDIA GPUs to be tested with DLSS and AMD GPUs to be tested with FSR, as AMD is effectively cheating in this performance chart, achieving a similar FPS uplift to DLSS at a lower output image quality. And this is indeed the difference in image quality between FSR2 quality and DLSS quality at 1080p. The DLSS image is generally more stable and better resolves fine detail, but in neither case would I call the image quality great. Generally, it's pretty blurry when you're upscaling at 1080p. While the 5700 XT loses comfortably to the RTX 2060 Super in Alan Wake 2 and shows the pain of not having mesh shaders in RDNA 1, it's even worse if you have a Pascal era GPU from NVIDIA, something from the GeForce 10 series. I happen to have a Titan X Pascal on hand. It was in my partner's PC, so I quickly ripped it out of there for testing. Hopefully she won't notice that her computer now doesn't work at all while I'm testing Alan Wake 2. Anyway, the Titan X Pascal, one of NVIDIA's fastest Pascal GPUs, delivers an abysmal level of performance in Alan Wake 2 using 1080p low settings, even with upscaling enabled. The Titan X is really only capable of about 20 FPS at best, and while some may disagree about 30 FPS gaming, there is no argument here. 20 FPS is unplayable. I would expect that all Pascal GPU owners will need to upgrade to play Alan Wake 2, even if they were targeting 1080p gaming on low settings. What's surprising about this is that generally speaking in other games, the Titan X Pascal is faster than the 5700 XT. The Titan X is usually around the performance of the GTX 1080 Ti, and we had the 1080 Ti as being 7% faster on average compared to the 5700 XT. In Alan Wake 2 though, comparing AMD's fastest non-mesh shaded GPU to NVIDIA's near fastest non-mesh shaded GPU, it has the 5700 XT delivering over 65% more performance. Not that this makes the 5700 XT especially playable, but that's a large difference, more than I anticipated when looking into the cards without mesh shader support. And finally, a quick look at ray tracing on the RTX 2060 Super. Even when playing at 1080p using the low preset with the ray tracing preset also set to low and using DLSS quality upscaling, the 2060 Super delivered an unplayable level of performance at just 26 FPS on average in the intensive forest area we looked at. In the best cases, you might see above 30 FPS, but for the most part, this GPU is totally unplayable with ray tracing enabled. And if we are revisiting predictions and opinions from 4 years ago, this type of experience we're seeing here shows why it was foolish to purchase a mainstream Turing GPU for the promise of ray tracing. 4 years on, we're starting to see these sorts of next generation ray traced games, and the RTX 2060 Super is simply incapable of accessing that experience. I'm not even talking about path tracing here, just the standard ray traced effects applied using the low settings at 1080p. This was always going to be the case as ray tracing matured. GPUs that weren't powerful enough for ray tracing to begin with weren't going to age well over time. So was the minor controversy around Alan Wake 2 not supporting mesh shaders overblown? I think it was, because the types of GPUs that don't support mesh shaders really aren't powerful enough for this demanding, beautiful PC game. While the performance of the RX 5700 XT and Titan X Pascal would likely be a bit better in the game were they capable of mesh shading, it wouldn't have transformed a relatively slow GPU by modern standards into a GPU that delivered a really playable experience. We can see that from cards of similar levels of performance like the RTX 2060 Super delivering pretty underwhelming levels of performance at low resolutions and quality settings. It's not surprising or unusual that the 7-year-old Pascal architecture is not fast enough for modern AAA PC games these days, but AMD did dodge a bit of a bullet here by their fastest RDNA 1 GPU being just the 5700 XT. This RDNA 1 GPU is a little over 4 years old, so not in any way a modern card, but if AMD did have an RDNA 1 GPU more in the range of the RTX 2080 Ti, the fastest GPU at the time, it could have been problematic for them in games like Alan Wake 2. The 2080 Ti would have aged a lot better, it's playable in this game, while the mythical high-end RDNA 1 card would have an outdated feature set and be effectively unsupported in Alan Wake 2 with likely mediocre performance. Do these findings change anything about our initial recommendation to purchase the RX 5700 XT? No. While the RTX 2060 Super here is undoubtedly the better GPU for Alan Wake 2, after 4 years, we're in a situation where the 5700 XT is typically around 13% faster in other games on average, while being 24% slower in Alan Wake 2. As most gamers with a card in this sort of performance range would be strongly considering an upgrade at this point, one outlier at the end of the GPU's life is simply not going to change that recommendation retroactively. We'd need many more examples at this point, and examples where the equivalent NVIDIA GPU was capable of a nice playable experience. Even if Alan Wake 2 didn't work at all on GPUs without mesh shaders, that still would have been unlikely to change our opinion for similar reasons. In fact, the lack of DirectX 12 Ultimate support on the 5700 XT, including the lack of support for both mesh shading and ray tracing, it hasn't been that big of a factor over the lifespan of the card to this point. If anything, the biggest feature difference between these products ended up being DLSS, which is totally separate to DX12 Ultimate. While at the launch of a card like the RTX 2060 Super, DLSS was fully irrelevant, it has since grown into a great feature, especially around 12 to 18 months after the release of those supermodels. So for the second half of these cards' life, NVIDIA buyers were treated to generally lower performance but better upscaling. On the other hand, RX 5700 XT owners had the opportunity to essentially upgrade their GPU into an RX 6700 XT for free during the mining booms. That was another unforeseen development that occurred after the card's release. If 5700 XT owners did take our advice there and proceeded with that upgrade, you'd be sitting pretty happy right now playing Alan Wake 2 without too many dramas. As it stands right now, both of these GPUs really aren't fast enough to play Alan Wake 2 at a decent level of performance. The 5700 XT, definitely not. The RTX 2060 Super, probably not for most people. So yeah, if you do have these GPUs, pretty much you'd be considering an upgrade at this point. And if you were thinking of buying a used GPU to use for Alan Wake 2 gaming, I believe the 5700 XT, they're about $130 used at the moment. The 2060 Super, about $140 to $150 used at the moment. It's probably not worth buying one of these cards specifically for this game, or really any games at this point maybe. I mean, it depends on the games that you're playing, of course. If it's like a lower end game, like an esports title or something, then you probably go with the 5700 XT because it is the faster and slightly cheaper used GPU. But in general, if you wanted that card that's going to support you for AAA titles like Alan Wake 2 and future GPUs. At the moment, you probably will need to spend a little bit more money. Anyway, that's it for this early look at Alan Wake 2 GPU performance in a configuration that I think was reasonably interesting given the whole situation with mesh shaders and RDNA 1. If you do want to give Steve some encouragement to work on that Alan Wake 2 GPU performance big benchmark sort of video, then please do leave some comments in the comment section below, giving him some nice positive feedback so we can get that encouragement, keep going, make some nice GPU benchmarks for us. If you do want to support our independent testing and all the videos that we do right here on Hardware Unboxed, then the best way to do that is via Patreon or Floatplane. Links are in the description below, and you gain some access to cool benefits like our Discord community, which has been, very much talking about Alan Wake 2 over the last couple of days. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.